Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 63rd Psalm. It is one of many of David's masterpieces in that book, and the title reads, A Psalm of David when he was in the wilderness of Judah. So David is identified as the author, and the most significant fact that we need to know about David is that he was identified as a man after God's own heart, alluded to implicitly in 1 Samuel 13:14. And referenced as such explicitly in Acts 13:22. And what does that mean exactly? Well, a man after God's own heart will exalt him and praise him, whether he abases or abounds, to borrow Paul's model in the New Testament, book of Philippians. But it's to really worship Yahweh with all our mind, might, strength, and ability, and it's to observe neither restraint or abandon in the course thereof. And this we witness in David. So he was capable of the sober reflections as expressed in the psalm, but he was also capable of dancing for the praise of Yahweh and to the consternation of his wife. But that we witness a consistency in David, who was born a shepherd, so he wasn't royal blood, but he established a dynasty. So he was elevated from the sheepfold to shepherd Yahweh's people in the palace and all throughout there. Now, David we often find as a man on the run throughout his life. First, when he had captured the anointing and the affection for the king of Israel, anointed by Samuel, and he had since captured the affection of Israel, which had, including Saul's own sons, so that compelled Saul in jealousy to rage against the will of the Father, to whom he had documented aversion thereto, by trying to kill him, and this sent David on the run. So many of the Psalms are written on the run in the wilderness, but here we witness him after triumphing over Saul, who died by his own hand after being defeated by the Philistines. He was established and essentially rose. All things were smooth. He established his rule and equity and his military dominance. He established the nation of Israel, united nation, into a force to be reckoned with amongst the neighboring nations. And so he was secure on his throne, but then he has his one major lapse, which ultimately resulted in the execution of Uriah, whose wife he had impregnated, which for that sin, which he is condemned in, and you can type in Corey Johnston, 2 Samuel 11:26 to 12:15 for more on that. But the consequence of that sin, after being rebuked by Nathan, who was the prophet, is that blood will follow him. So his family will be divided now. Not long then after, the daughter of his firstborn wife, or second, the biological sister of Absalom, and the half sister of Amnon, who is David's eldest. David had many wives. He is enraptured by the sight of his half sister, which ultimately compels him to the extremity of raping her. This prompts Absalom's rage, who murders him in public. And from being exiled, Absalom proceeds to raise a grievance, which culminates in a rebellion against his father. So he essentially tries to usurp his throne. So David, from that lofty position, having been raised from the sheepfold to the palace, finds himself once more back in the wilderness. So the opening verse reads, O Elohim, you are my El. I earnestly seek you. My being has thirsted for you. My flesh has longed for you, in a dry and thirsty land without water. So there's a lot to digest here. We're going to break it from the top. The first thing we notice is that he has a possessive pronoun to describe El. So even though he is not rich in the ways of the world at this present juncture, being without a palace and on the run, being a fugitive, he still has the possession which transcends all other possessions, and from whom all possessions derive. So he's earnestly seeking him because his circumstances are nothing to praise about. So this stirs an earnestness in his quest for him. And he was brought low to the ground in order to seek him out. So he was fulfilling the purpose and progressing accordingly. And the thirst, now, we often use sensory analogies, are prolific throughout scriptures to describe the experience of encountering the divine presence, and thirst is the appetite which seeks to be fulfilled through that experience. So that's what he means by the sensory analogy. And the flesh has longed for you. That means he just cannot wait. It's been too long coming, and the fact is that he was estranged from God when he sinned against Uriah, and he was paying for the price for it now, but he's longing to be restored once more into his good graces. So he finds himself in a dry and thirsty land without water. He's on the run, and he's in the desert. Desert is sparse water sources there, and water is critical to his survival. So what does he say from that? Therefore I have had a vision of you in the sacred place, to see your power and your esteem. So this is a reference to the Ark of the Covenant, which he went to great lengths to recover and restore in the tabernacle, and he wanted to be the one to build the temple, but he was forbidden as such by Yahweh. But even though he had beheld his presence in there, he's recalling the presence in all its splendor and majesty, and the presence of divinity is never ever located to one location. To claim such is to deprive him of his attribute of omnipresence. And so he's still mindful of his power and his splendor. Now, what surrounds him is nothing to brag about or be praiseworthy or positive, but he does have cause to praise not his circumstances, but the one who transcends all circumstances and can guide us through and over any circumstances which come our way. Because your kindness is better than life, my lips praise you. So that's a pretty tall compliment for kindness, because what is better than life than human beings are oriented to treasure life above all else, and will in fact go to great lengths to preserve it and improve it. But he's saying that the divine kindness is of greater value, so it's truly priceless in its preciousness. And my lips praise you. That's what he's doing. He with all his faculties and all his capacities, that means his lips were engaged, his heart was engaged, and his mind was engaged. Therefore I bless you while I live. In your name I lift up my hands. So even though he doesn't have a lot to brag about, he still has his life, and in as much as he has a life, he's going to venerate the author of that life, the one who can give meaning to life. And we can find meaning in him no matter what circumstances what circumstances we find ourselves out in life. And in your name, so the name, that being Yahweh, he lifts up his hands. That is, he's not only lifting up his hands, but his mind and his heart and his entire being and substance. My being is satisfied as the marrow in fatness, and my mouth praises you with singing lips. So he's not singing about his circumstances, but he's singing about the one who transcends those circumstances and gives him not only hope, but sustenance and spiritual substance in the midst of his trials. So once more we see the principle of exalting, whether abound or abased, alluded to by Paul in Philippians. When I remember you on my bed, I meditate on you in the night watches. So the idea of a lot of people reserve the final prayer of the day to before they fall asleep. That's something I personally do. And in all honesty, I rarely wake up and pray first. That's difficult for me to do. But at the very minimum, I think I would recommend that a baby believer spend at least one moment of extended duration in prayer a day, and the best way to do that is to have him at the mind of the end of the day. That way he can bless you in your sleep and make you up refreshed and renewed for what you have to do tomorrow. But the meditation, now David was a man prone to meditation, and meditation is an integral component of our dialogue with divinity. Now, we tend to we minimize the potential of prayer when we think of it as an exclusively talking vehicle, but there is also an element of listening. So what we have to say to divinity is all well and good, but not so significant in itself as what divinity has to say to us. And to do that, we must adopt the mindset of meditation, and it's completely scriptural. And the now the unfortunate circumstance in history in which we find ourselves is that we are surrounded by culture which connects meditation to esoteric Eastern and New Age spiritual movements, and the difference of our version of meditation and their version is their version empties the conscience, our version fills the conscience. For you have been my help, and in the shadows of your wings I sing. So he's acknowledging that he had guided him this far. He had forsaken him, but Yahweh did not forsake him, and he had a greater purpose in him to restore him to the position of prominence, whereby he could once more administer equitable justice, as he lapsed significantly so in the case of Uriah. But the shadows of wings, people find now wings, Yahweh doesn't literally have wings, but we anthropomorphize him using familiar concepts to explain the unfamiliar. But the idea entailed is that wings is a place one can find healing, one can find solace, and one can sing, as does David. My being has closely followed you. Your right hand upholds me. So once more, Yahweh doesn't have a literal right hand, at least not a physical one, but the analogy is appropriate for he had oriented his whole being, his body, mind, and soul, to the will of the Father, which is to be the pursuit of the saints, which is not nullified or made inviolate by any change in dispensation. But those who seek to destroy my life go into the lower parts of the earth. So this was the present reality, and the tragic reality was that the one who sought to destroy his life was none other than his most beloved son, Absalom, whom he could not bring to himself to punish adequately for the murder of his brother in the response to the rape of his full sister. But the comedy of errors and the chain of events as divinely orchestrated culminated in Absalom leading a rebellion, and this put David on the run. So Absalom clearly meant business, and he did have a grievance to administer against David's justice in that he was inaccessible to them, because so he sought to exploit that. But David did have enemies, and he did not delight in the destruction of his enemies, but he did delight in the one who had orchestrated the destruction. They are handed over to the power of the sword. They become a portion for jackals. So in other words, they eventually become worm food. They return to the dust, as do all physically dead people. And those who live by the sword die by the sword. So Absalom and those he compelled to follow it, took it upon themselves to try to seize power in an armed coup, and they ended up as worm food in the final analysis. Long story short, Absalom caught himself on the hinges of an outstretched tree while fleeing from his pursuers. But let the king rejoice in Elohim. Let everyone who swears by him exult, for the mouth of those speaking lies are stopped. So as the king, he had a responsibility, as outlined in Deuteronomy 17, to let the law be his daily meditation and contemplation and guide and compass. And the result of that would be rejoicing in Elohim. Now, and let everyone who swears by him exalt. So this is a call to the nation of Israel, and the call echoes to our present dispensation. And for the mouth of those speaking lies are stopped. That means that there is no lie that can be brought before the presence of him who is the embodiment of truth, any more than sin or any negative or corrupt attribute that we may conceivably bring to the judgment. So start to finish, we learn a lot about David in how to respond and how to praise when abounded, which translates as in travail or in negative circumstances. But we do have a model, and we do have an Elohim, and we are to look to him wherever we find ourselves in prosperity or persecution. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.